So we move into Judges, and you might think of Judges as sort of the Joshua Part Two, um, certainly a continuation of the story that was told in Joshua. So let's set the scene. In Joshua, we've established that the Israelites have come into the land, and there's a lot of violence, and um, there was the conquest of the land, and so Judges then moves into this period where they have settled and they're trying to figure out, okay, now that we've settled in this land, how do we live? They kind of scatter about the land into these different tribes, and so they enter what we're going to call the tribal period because they're not unified. There's no central government. There's no central leader. There's just sort of this group of loosely connected tribes. So typically we think about the 12 tribes of Israel, right? Chapter one lays them out. Um, and That's typically accepted. But then you read a little further on in chapter five, there's 10 tribes. And then there's other tribes that are introduced that don't get included in these long lists, but they're clearly part of the deal too. Um, there's questions that you might ask of, well, okay, so there's all these tribes sort of scattered about, but they're sort of loosely connected. They have this history together. They all consider themselves part of Israel, part of God's people. So how do they work together? Economically, socially, religiously? Do they have neat geographical boundaries? Um, all of those questions are kind of unclear. Um, the sort of biographical stuff, demographical stuff, I should say, like that is um, not always obvious in Judges. So, a comparison that's helpful for me, and it may not be helpful for you, but if you read the history of the United States, most of the time before the Civil War in the 1860s, the country was referred to as these United States, and then after the Civil War, referred to as the United States. Before the Civil War, seen much more as a bunch of independent states who happened to kind of have this central government, but it was a far more like I would be a resident of Illinois. I would think of myself as a resident of Illinois, a citizen of Illinois, before I thought of myself as in a citizen of the United States. I think maybe that's a little bit kind of akin to these loosely connected tribes. Uh, how they would have thought of themselves in the tribal period. So the book itself is this composite then of this tribal period of these independent stories. Um, Kind of here's several things that happened during the tribal period. Some of these things are connected. Some of them don't seem to have all that much connection to one another. It Judges is not necessarily this kind of neat. This happened and then this happened and then this happened. It does seem to be that composite of independent stories. And so it's not always linear. It's not always in a straight line. It's not always polished canonically. So there's that word again. I've used a few times. The canon is the collection of the Bible, the books of the Bible in the order in which we have them. Our 66 books is the canon, and so the story. What I mean to say is not always polished and linear um, from one book to another. So, for instance, at the end of Joshua, it says, "Well, now Joshua's dead, and Israel has conquered all the land." But then right away in Judges it says, "Well, hang on, Joshua's not quite dead, and they got most of it, but not quite all of it." So there's some tension there, and then it's not always linear and polished internally either. Again, I said this in our Joshua video, but I'll say it again. This is still a group of people hundreds of years later remembering these communal stories that have been told across campfires for generations and generations. And they're remembering not only that far in the past, but it's this confusing, uncertain time in their past. And so there is to be expected a little bit of ambiguity, I suppose. So most of these stories focus on how these tribes fell into bad behavior and then were taken over by these oppressing nations, and then up pop these so-called judges who helped to get them out of their situation after the people had come back to God and repented. And it's just sort of this cycle of faith, unfaith, faith, unfaith, faith, unfaith, and these judges come in and help them out during this time. So um, you'll see throughout these phrases, they did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, or everyone did what was right in their own eyes, which is sort of not it's not always clear exactly what that means, but this again this cycle of faith, unfaith, faith, unfaith. Uh, One of the clearer examples of one of the things that happened is in Judges 19, and when you get to it, you'll read it. But it's this horribly gruesome and violent story, and I mean, this is like horror movie stuff um, that they did. And so again, just like with Joshua, Judges is prescriptive. It is not prescriptive. It is descriptive. So it's not saying these are all good things. Make sure you go do them. It's just saying this is what happened. It's Judges in many ways is a history book. So who are these judges anyway? When you think judge, you probably think person who sits in this really high chair in a courthouse and wears a powdered wig, right? That's not what we're thinking in biblical terms when we think judge. We're thinking more like military hero or military leader, some kind of unifier. So there's primarily two kinds of judges in the book of Judges. So the one that's not mentioned quite as often, and we don't get as much information about, is someone who's a leader who has some sort of temporary office over all of Israel, who unites the tribes in some way. We really don't get much information on them, and they're always temporary. They don't last long. And then the second one, these are sort of the central characters of the book. These are people who emerge to resolve situations of conflict. Sometimes it's internal conflict. Sometimes it's one person against another. Sometimes it's one tribe against another. And sometimes it's a tribe against some outsider group. And so they take on this kind of militaristic leader role. And again, they're usually temporary to kind of, because they're not a king, to help to resolve this conflict in these cycles of faith, unfaith, faith, unfaith, faith, unfaith. So that's who the judges are. So you read about people like Samson or Deborah or Gideon. These are the judges we'll read about in the book of Judges. And so then finally, this sort of underlying question that's maybe somewhat unanswered that we're going to keep having in the next several books of the Old Testament into Kings and Samuel. Who does God want his people to be? And how should they live? Okay, so now we're in the land promised to us. Now what? That's the question that's underlying all of this.